lost you.
Before Bruce, you say something so wise that we'll say, why didn't we have that on a recording? We need to record you, Bruce. But in terms of this first reading, this is, if you kind of know where things are at with it, in Exodus chapter 20 is when we get the list of the 10 Commandments. In fact, it's from right after this scene that we have. For the next 12 chapters, we get laws. Everyone likes to think that the law is the 10 Commandments. And the thing is the law goes a lot further than just the 10 Commandments as far as the Jews are concerned. But one of the things that I'm interested in with this passage, oh, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to notice your questions for the week, here, wait for it. You'll see in the first question, what was I able to include but a reference to?
Let me guess.
So, Revelation, here we go. I could always find a way to get Revelation in there. So I wanted to have those up for you because this Exodus is probably one of the three main places that whenever we, especially Lutherans, it's not just a Lutheran thing, but we as Lutherans make sure to talk about it. Whenever we talk about what we call a priesthood of all believers, this passage in Exodus is one of the three places that we end up hearing this talked about. And it's right in here where we hear God say, "You shall be for me." Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Hold on a minute. Somebody's joining us that I don't know who they are.
It's me again, Pastor. I lost you completely.
Oh, okay. All right, Bertie.
I'm trying to get on using my phone.
Okay. All right.
Or it could be me because I was having trouble with one. And so then I tried to launch one on the iPad. And now I see my screen says Zoom.
Okay.
So I'm evidently launching the other one too. So.
Okay.
Trying to stop it, but I'm not being successful.
All right. No problem.
Okay.
No problem. Just making sure that we get everyone we need here. No, but you get it's this passage in Exodus where it says, "You shall be for me a priestly kingdom." That we have this whole idea that the idea of priest, even though there's a distinct class of priest within Judaism, that starts with the law. Is not something that is limited to the people, because you have God here saying, "You shall be for me a priestly kingdom." The other two places that we end up seeing this is, as I list in here, is in 1 Peter. We have it where, like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then here comes Revelation. To him who loves us and freed us from our sins by his blood and made us to be a kingdom, priests serving his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So I bring this all up. In fact, I was thinking about, as I was kind of going through here, these lessons this week, and I thought, this is kind of interesting. I always like to talk about how, I'm going to stop sharing, how with Lutherans, we like to talk about three things. If you were to ask me, what does it mean to be a Lutheran? It's not our liturgy. What it means to be a Lutheran in terms of what we emphasize is we emphasize justification by faith. We emphasize a theology of the cross, and we emphasize the priesthood of all believers. That's the Pastor David Armstrong-Reiner, three emphases, but justification by faith, I think you get pretty much agreement, for anyone who's gone through a Lutheran confirmation class. If you haven't heard justification by faith, someone hasn't been teaching confirmation right, or you haven't been listening to it right on it. But the other two are really important. And what I find interesting in our passages that we have this week is there can be a way that you can say that you end up seeing all three of those. And the priesthood of all believers is found right here in this first passage with, "You shall be for me a priestly kingdom." I always talk about the fact that I think with us as Lutherans, when we talk about the priesthood of all believers, what we're saying is that we are all called. This idea of call is not something that is limited to a pastor. Every single one of you are called, whether it's, I'm just looking. Let's see. Ward, okay, you do have a position right there at Stockbridge Presbyterian Church, okay? Mm-hmm. Everybody else here, you're called to retirement. So, but we're all called. But, in some ways we're called different ways, aren't we? We have different personal callings, not just the job that we have, but we're called as spouses, as parents, as grandparents. We're called, Bruce and Bruce. I think about what you all do with the yard.
We're called to the yard.
You're called to the yard, and I am so grateful for the two of you. In terms of that being part of your calling. We all have calls, and so I almost dislike the question when somebody says, "Well, tell me about your call," as if it's only a pastor that has a call, because everybody is called, and that's part of this priesthood of all believers. And the only thing I find most interesting about when the Lutheran Church emphasizing that is that the Lutheran Church in ages past, back, Bruce Allstrand, when you were just a young boy. So
long time ago.
I think about when I have heard of Lutheran churches in the past, they were based off a model that was always called the Herr Pastor, or, Bruce, the Swedish equivalent of it, correct?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but it was this idea that whatever the pastor said goes. And I always find that, okay, here's a good example of the word irony, which I think is one of the most misused words I know. Irony is the church that emphasizes the priesthood of all believers is the one that in ages past has had the biggest problem living that out, because it's made the pastor the final authority, where the pastor is not. So, but for what it's worth. So if the one thing you can hear from me in this first passage is to hear, you are called, Brian and Ward and Tim and Bertie and Gary and Bruce, you are called. You are called.
Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Because I can't see you.
Oh, okay.
Anybody.
Okay. I don't know, Gary.
Okay.
But you can hear us.
I can, yeah.
What do you see on your screen right now, Gary?
It just shows all files, and it's the Zoom installer. It says paren 8 exe.
It sounds like, Bertie, the problem you were having.
Yes, that's why I had to go to my phone.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Okay. I don't know, Gary.
Don't worry. I'll be.
Hey,
I'm still here.
I'm lucky. I know what I know about Zoom right now, so we're doing pretty good. So, my last comment on the first lesson, unless you all have any comments too, is I also find it interesting that all the people of Israel get out there and say, whatever God has said, we will do. But you know what happens once the law is given, right? Bertie's shaking his head. Bertie, what happens when the law is given?
Made an idol.
That's right. Moses comes down and they're worshiping a golden calf. So, that's kind of good news for us, right? Whenever you think you're all committed to things and then we mess it all up, it's like, hey, it's okay. If the Israelites can all commit to what God's doing and then end up messing it up, we get some second chances too. So just as long as we don't get thrown into a wilderness for 40 years. But lately, I think we've come, it feels like we're getting pretty darn close to it. So, but it's only been 3 months, folks. It hasn't been 40 years. So that's, all right. Anything else? Coffee hasn't hit enough. Let's go on to Let's see.
That's how we break with the Catholics, right? Because they don't really believe in the priesthood of the believer, do they? They have to go through intercession.
Well, they're doing a better job of it, but you're right, Ward. That was that sort of authority. Hold on a minute. I got to hit share and then not hit share to come back to it, Ward. Especially and Ward, probably that's a good point because it's kind of funny, isn't it, that was one of the things that Luther emphasizes that really causes that break back in the Reformation. That's what makes it even more interesting, that though that's one of the things that leads to that break when you put such sole authority into the church itself. It's kind of interesting that the Lutheran Church itself oftentimes has fallen into that same pattern on there. But you're right, Ward. That led to a break. The Catholic Church, I would say, is not there now, although some people treat it as if it were, but as a whole is not there. I discovered in about a year ago, the church, the other church I would tell you that emphasizes the priesthood of all believers as one of their central things that they emphasize is the Disciples of Christ congregation. And I don't think we have any in Rockdale or Newton County. But where I first encountered them, we lost somebody. Oh, we lost Gary. Gary must be trying to get things fixed. What is interesting about the Disciples of Christ congregation, when I first encountered their congregation, is you go to a disciples congregation, the pastor does not have to be the one to preside over communion. Lay people can preside over communion in the disciples congregation. And I've always thought about that. Okay, this is probably one of those places that if you want to turn me into, okay, Bruce, I'm giving you ammunition. If you want to go to the bishop, you can go to the bishop on this one. But this is one of those things I will tell you that I probably have my disagreement with the Lutheran Church about, even though as a ordained Lutheran pastor, I will follow along with it, because the disciples kind of have it right. Why should it be that only the pastor can preside over communion? What makes the pastor more empowered than anything? Those of you that are familiar with a lot of the medical profession and nurses know that any nurse on an emergency room floor is empowered to do baptisms, because there's emergency situations in which baptisms, need to happen. Why? And we as a Lutheran Church recognize that. Why, as a church, do we who talk about the priesthood of all believers say that only the pastor can preside over communion? Now, the answer, by the way, there is an answer to this. The answer is always there has to be good order. That's usually the answer you'll hear. I'll tell you, I'm not satisfied with that answer, but once again, it's one of those things that, I'll give you a good example where we ended up having this is, if you recall, about a year and a half ago, I ended up that when we were coming back off of our Christmas our post-Christmas vacation, my mother-in-law passed away. And so we were already back in the Midwest, but it extended our time in the Midwest for an extra week. But I didn't have any coverage on that particular Sunday. But we had Holly, there as the intern. So I gave up, but I knew I better give the bishop a call, the bishop at the time. And so I called him up to say, can Holly have temporary dispensation so she can preside over communion, since I hadn't been there? And what was interesting is I was actually surprised, because I've known that to happen in the past. Our bishop said no. It's a different bishop now, but I know that our present bishop would say no too. He did make sure, he said one of the assistants to the bishop was able to come. Holly was able to preach, and because I talked with her. but she was able to preach, and he had an assistant come who offered up his services, out of pastoral care, so he could preside over communion. But that was one of those times. It's like, oh, come on, it was one of those. I confess to you, there was part of me that many of you have heard me say, the old line that it is easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. This was one of those times that I wish I simply had asked for forgiveness rather than for permission. So it was, but sorry, Ward, that was a much longer answer to your question on that. But it's just,
you probably made the right decision.
Oh, I think so. It's
somebody in the congregation that would have objected. Don't know who, but there might have been somebody.
Bruce Allstrand would have been calling up the bishop on Monday, right, Bruce? So
I would have been happy to preside on communion the day you were gone.
Well, there you go. Well, and I remember the other time I remember this being an issue is when I was in interim myself. I was in interim down in Montgomery. This is before, and interestingly enough, I was in interim down in Montgomery. And this is why I thought it would be no problem. Now, this is back in 1999. Way back in those old days. Back when I was in interim, this was before I was ordained, but I was given dispensation to do communion. That's why I didn't think it was going to be a problem. But they had a retired Lutheran pastor. Because it was in Montgomery and because I was living in Stone Mountain, we made arrangements that I would only be there 3 days a week. And there was a retired Lutheran pastor that was in the congregation who has kind of the same feelings about communion that we don't have. It's not like, you always hear me jokingly refer to that when I was ordained, I got magic fingers, to preside over communion. And Ed Beckstrom had the kind of the same idea on that. But we would always have Ed kind of preside over communion, and he would kind of say, well, we really should just have people do it. Really should have Bruce Allstrand come down here and do it. But, I mean, it was, it was the same thing. But yeah, no, it's we always run into this. We use this excuse of good order sometimes of getting in the way of the fact that we're all called. So sometimes I think this is where my Presbyterian, being raised Presbyterian, my Presbyterian upbringing sometimes kicks in to say, oh, come on, just give them toast and Coca-Cola if you have to, just make sure it gets blessed. All right, let's try this. Let's try Bertie.
Yes, sir.
Can you see things?
Yes, I can. I've got the lesson printed out.
Oh, you got, well, there you go. Oh, Gary's going to try to enter again. Hold on a minute. So Gary's going to be trying to enter. So Bertie, hold on a minute. Let me bring us down to the Psalm. And you see the Psalm. Oh, yeah. Well, you said you have it printed anyway.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been able to read it.
Okay. All right. Well, Bertie, go ahead and read for us Psalm 100.
Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into God's presence with a song. Know the Lord is good, our Maker to whom we belong. We are God's people and the sheep of God's pasture. Enter the gates of the Lord with thanksgiving and the courts with praise. Give thanks and bless God's holy name. God indeed is Lord, whose steadfast love is everlasting, whose faithfulness endures from age to age.
Thank you, Bertie. All right. Gary, are you back with us? Oh, Gary's still connecting to audio. Okay. This is one of my favorite Psalms. This was, I think I probably have told you the story before. My love of Scripture came because I was an insomniac as a kid. But what I mean by that is I remember one time is I would always, I could never go to sleep, or I'd wake up in the middle of the night But I remember that I was staying with my sister. I was the youngest, so I was staying with my sister and her husband. And one time when I couldn't go to sleep, I went out into the living room. I was probably about 9, 10 years old. My brother-in-law was out there reading his Bible. And so I asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well," says, "whenever I can't get to sleep or whenever I wake up in the middle of the night, I end up reading my Bible. It helps me out." And I said, "Wow, that sounds kind of cool." So that's what I started doing. And I think my parents appreciated it, because it means that I stopped bugging them when I couldn't fall asleep in the middle of the night or I woke up in the middle of the night, because I would just turn on my light, and start reading my Bible. But I learned over time that there are certain passages that are always good to go to and certain passages not to go to. So I kind of had to always favor passages, and the Psalms are, some of the Psalms, like talking, the end of Psalm 137, where it talks about bashing in the heads of babies, was not one of those Psalms I went to in the middle of the night. But Psalm 100 was. So, by the way, in case you're wondering, Gary is still connecting to audio. We can see, Gary, I don't know if you can hear us. We can see you, Gary. It says we can't hear you yet. So, this Psalm is in such brief words, I think, is just always so great in terms of just talking about, this whole idea of Thanksgiving. And I think especially, some of the parts I like, just this: "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all you lands." And this is always the going line that we talk about. Ward, I know you as a choir director like beautiful noises, right? Among those singing. But we all know that not everybody can be in the choir, right, Ward?
That's true. Yeah.
So for those who aren't in the choir, we get to remind them sometimes of, it doesn't say, the Psalm doesn't say you have to make a beautiful noise to the Lord. All it says is make a joyful noise to the Lord. So, whatever that is. And we've all known, and, I haven't seen this, but I speaking of growing up, there was this, and this probably is, you probably will bring to mind someone in your past on it, but there was this one guy. His son was a classmate of mine, but John Moore, who was in our church. John was a unique person. The whole family was unique, but John loved to sing.
Mm-hmm.
And John could not find a tune for the life of him. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I should take that back. He could find a tune. It just wasn't necessarily the one we were all singing. And because John loved to sing and John made a joyful noise, everybody knew that John Moore was making a joyful noise, because it was a whole different noise than the one we were listening to. But when I think about John Moore singing, that's part of what we're called to do. Is we're not perfect, but we're called to make a joyful noise. And if the joyful noise is beautiful, then if you're at Stockbridge Presbyterian Church, you join the choir there with Ward, or if you're at Epiphany Lutheran, you join the choir with Don. And just know that you can join the choir when we can have choirs again. That's we got to wait a little bit with all the COVID stuff going on right now. But it's just, but the idea is that, but in a way, to lead to that, that's kind of what led to my devotion, my written devotion that I wrote last night. Is it just hits me, as much as I love this psalm, this is kind of a weird time that here we're talking, the psalm is here, make a joyful noise to the Lord. But I guess this week, my way that I would say it is, for those that are gathered together, the advice is make a joyful noise, but just make a quiet, joyful noise, okay? Because or make a joyful noise when you're watching the service at home, because it's one of but maybe that's the whole point in some ways. Much as I would love to be able to hear someone like John Moore of my past, or hearing a choir, or whether it's in tune or out of tune, a joyful noise just means a joyful noise. It means the attitude that we express it with. And maybe that's a reminder too. And we probably also can do that, because I can think of churches of the past. Let's all face this. I mean, that there are probably many times that there are churches that we have been involved with in the past in which it may be a beautiful noise that's up there, but when you looked at their face, it sure didn't seem like it was very joyful up there. So joyful doesn't mean whether you're in tune or out of tune. Joyful is an expression of who you are. Yeah. So there's my thoughts. Other thoughts? I mean, Ward, I'm sure as a choir director, that's what you're asking, right? Not just for them to sing beautifully, right, and together,
Right.
but it's how they express themselves. So,
And Don and I dealt with that last our Advent program. There were
Yeah.
a whole lot of variances in abilities, but we accept everybody.
right,
We were in total agreement on that.
yeah, and that can be hard. That can be hard. That can be hard. I knew this one church that I had interviewed at for an associate position. It was a big church that, and that was one of the big issues. It became a big point of contention because there was a young woman with special needs that wanted to sing in the choir. And there was some pushback over whether she should be allowed in the choir or not. And it finally came down to, I mean, you think about what this says here, make a joyful noise. That it's like, if she wants to be there, it's important that she be there. We're the place that's meant to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So make allowances from there. But yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we push on. As always, we kind of touch down on some of these lessons, sometimes more than others. Let's see. Let me bring it up again. Bruce Hefner,
Yes.
do you have the lessons in front of you?
Well, I have my Bible.
Oh, good. Oh my gosh. What are we going to do with someone that has their Bible? I don't know, Bruce. So
Listen to them.
Bruce, can you read to us Romans 5, 1-8?
I think I can. Okay.
Okay.
Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we still were sinners, Christ died for us.
Great. Thank you, Bruce.
Mm-hmm.
When getting back to, even though I didn't put this in the questions, when I talked at the beginning about the fact that it ends up that you can make an argument that we can find all three of the Lutheran emphases in the lessons. Where it hit me was, I thought, okay, you got priesthood of all believers in the first lesson. We start off at the very beginning of this, since we are justified by faith. And I said, oh, okay, we got priesthood of all believers. We got justification by faith. We just need a theology of the cross. So the way I can fit this in is that we do have at the end that, what is it that saves us? It's Christ dying for us. But even more, when we talk about a theology of the cross, it's even more than the fact that the emphasis that Christ's death is what has set us free, which we certainly have that here. But you also have this emphasis, and that's the other part of this whole idea of the theology of the cross, is the contrast is you have churches out there that have what is called a theology of glory. And it goes along the lines of this. If you just believe in God, all your problems are going to be solved. Your financial worries are going to be gone. You're going to have great health. To which I can only say is, I'm not sure what Bible you're reading. I think you need to go back to Job and kind of see what kind of happened to Job along the way. But, and we get certain characters that get associated with it. I mean, probably some big ones is, over next to us in DeKalb County, you got old Creflo. Is Creflo? No, Creflo's not in DeKalb, is he? Where's Creflo Dollar at these days? Anyone know? World Changers. Where are they at, Ward?
They're in Atlanta.
They're in Atlanta. I was trying to think who the one is that's down there in DeKalb County, down in Lithonia. There's one down there.
Well, they changed pastors a while back. A young fellow. That's
right. Okay, but you get churches out there like that, and even to the point of we kind of joked about the guy who I'd never heard of, but he was talking with someone that I had, that said that. What was it? When the guy that a couple years ago that was asking for the money to get his jet plane. You remember that one?
Yeah, that's the church you were talking.
Yeah.
South DeKalb. Yeah.
South. Well, there's that one, but there was the one that kind of made some big news because he was on with another guy, and they said, "Well, if Jesus was around, Jesus would be flying first class." So. I was like, I don't know if you're reading the same Jesus I am, but the whole point of it, when we talk about a theology of the cross, is we say, Jesus knows our suffering. Jesus knows what we're going through, because Jesus went through that, and because Jesus went through it, we need to know that our suffering does not mean any sort of judgment. Suffering is just suffering. What we're going through is what we're going through. And it was probably why I had this, I think I had this, I talked a few weeks ago that I was having, I think, a running argument with one of the other pulpit column, pastor columns that was in the Rockdale paper. He came out with something, and then, if you looked a couple weeks later, you'd see me with my response, and a couple weeks later, you'd see his response to me. But it had to do with when we started this whole pandemic, and what I took offense to was to look at this pandemic and somehow say that this is a judgment of God. And, my simple answer is no, mm-hmm. It's not. It is what it is. And sometimes I think we just have to say with suffering, it is what it is. We can determine how we're going to approach suffering or how we can be in suffering. But sometimes it's just realizing that what we feel is what we feel. So if you get angry, get angry. If you're sad, be sad. But at some point, be able to ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I be faithful in the midst of this? And in some ways we get that answer here in Romans, when you hear this whole line of, here Paul's talking about we boast in our sufferings. That's a whole completely different attitude towards suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. And I think there's something to that. That doesn't mean, and by the way, there's always a danger in this sometimes with some people I know, that people think, well, then are you trying to say that this happened because God's trying to teach me something? And my answer to that is just as emphatic, no. What I'm trying to say is, no matter what we're going through, we can learn from it. We can, it can help us place our faith more in God in the way. I mean, here's what the biggest example I can give as a personal one is before Christopher was born, Mary had 4 miscarriages. Why did Mary have 4 miscarriages? Because she did. There's the answer for you as far as if you're going to ask me why. Here's what was interesting, and especially after the 3rd one, and that was when we had moved here the first time. What was interesting to me is because we had gone through that, I knew when I started, when you've had miscarriages, those that have gone through that or are going through that tend to open up a little more. That's one thing. But the other thing is I could be there with some of the husbands who were dealing with it because I knew some of what they were going through. It's kind of like, in some ways you could almost think about it as what helps out those that are recovering alcoholics? Well, going to AA and being around other recovering alcoholics. What helps out those who are going through, having a spouse or going through cancer? Being around those that know what it means to have a spouse who's gone through cancer, that knows exactly what's going on. You think about, with so many of our veterans that have been dealing with PTSD, what's helps them out is being around other veterans, knowing what they've been going through. That doesn't mean we go through. God didn't have us go through that so that we can be there for one another, but because we have been, we can be there for one another. And by the way, I forgot the one personal. It's just like, and because I've seen this so many times. Speaking of with Christopher, as we've been dealing with him being on the autism spectrum, it has also meant that we're able to be there for other people, who are going through that. So I guess it's all a way to say, no matter what we're going through, if we have this attitude that Paul talks about here, that says, remember, I'm not ready to boast I'm not with Paul yet. Okay. I'm not ready to boast in my sufferings. I'm not going, but if I can start taking an approach of what can God show me in this? And sometimes I need to keep asking that question. Where's the endurance? Where's the character? Okay, I am a character, but where's the character? Okay. That can lead hopefully to the hope, but, so there you go. Theology of the cross and justification by faith and priesthood all believers. You get all 3 Lutheran emphases in less than an hour. How's that for you? So, but, all right. Are we ready for the gospel lesson?
What does here in 6?
What's that, Bertie?
What does Paul mean here in 6? For while we were weak, we were still weak. At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly.
Ooh, that's a good question, Bertie. How do you take it?
I don't understand the right time.
Yeah, what is the right time? That's a good question, isn't it? What is the right time? Unless it's Paul's more talking about it is it's at the right time. Maybe Paul's talking about in some ways, I guess, because one of the driving things I'm just going to speak from Paul's perspective and then we can take it to ours, is Paul throughout the whole book of Romans is going to be trying to deal with this whole tension between Jesus came as a Jew But then this message became so important for the Gentiles. And Paul will deal in the end in the whole book of Romans with, okay, but with the Jews that end, for those Jews who did reject him, what are we going to do about that? And Paul ends up coming to that whole argument of, well, if their rejection has led to the Gentiles accepting, God will make sure that the Jews will get in the end. I mean, that's part of the big thing. So for Paul, Bertie, maybe perhaps what he's talking about is when he talks about when Paul's probably talking about the ungodly, he's thinking about the non-Jews. He's thinking about the Gentiles. And so I think probably what Paul's talking about here is at this right time, Christ died so that this can happen, that this message would not just be for the Jews, it would be for the Gentiles. There's a way that the times all kind of come into play in which this message could have a more powerful effect. I think that's what Paul's probably trying to deal with. It's in some ways, okay, I'm going to speak Lutheran. Since we're talking Lutheran theology, we'll kind of go along with this. You could almost say at the right time, Martin Luther came around. There were other people who tried to reform the church or tried to call the church to account before Martin Luther. You know what happened to them? They died, they got killed, right?
Yeah.
Luther came at the right time because he was born in Germany. The German princes were tired of the authority of the Roman, church that took such political authority and exerted such political authority over Western Europe. And so the German princes, when they heard Luther with his message of, hey, it's not works that saves us, it's purely grace through faith. They capitalized on that as a way. They protected him. The German princes protected him. So that, he had to hide out for years, which also helped us because he translated the Bible into German along the way, which was the, first time in a long time that you had a translation into the language of the people. But, it was one of these cases in which Luther was one of those that came at the right time just because of the circumstances. And I think Paul might be saying that a little bit, that this seems to be the right time. There's a way that sometimes we keep trying to do things, and sometimes you just have to wait for the right time. When is the right time? We don't know when the right time is. We put our trust in a God who does know when the right time is. So when Jesus comes along and Paul comes along to be able to proclaim this to the Gentiles, it was the right time. So, Bertie, does that help?
Yes, for the ungodly.
Yeah. It's kind of good, okay? Because we can all feel kind of ungodly sometimes, right? So, well, and that brings up it's like, okay, I got 10 minutes, and we have to read a lesson, and I have to, so last week I couldn't share with you things that I had down, so this time I can. So, but let's get to the lesson itself. I'll go ahead and read the gospel for you this time.
It's long.
There we go. Yeah, it is. Should mean a short sermon this time. We need Bill here. Should mean a short sermon, Bruce, right?
Right.
So Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news: the kingdom of God has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or staff, for the laborers deserve their wages. You know, I just realized something. Okay, hold on a minute. You know what? I'm going to stop, because even though this is great stuff on here, I realized that when you get your bulletin, you're not going to see the rest of this lesson. It's the optional part of the lesson. And for some reason, when I printed out, when I had Valerie printed out, I guess I'm taking the option that I'm stopping there at verse 8. So even though I could read on, which this is always some good stuff that's going on there, especially with I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We'll just deal with what I have, with what I have there. You all okay with that?
Except for one thing, the last word you said was wages, and it should be food.
Oh, food. Sorry. You know why? It's because I was trying to get to it. That's why I was trying to look at my thing on here. With my sharing, I'm blocking out the words right there. So I was trying to remember the words, and I was remembering them imperfectly. So, Bruce. But no, there's some good stuff in that last part, but there's probably enough to deal with in the first part and in the limited time that we have to be able to do that. More than I would say, it is really interesting to think about that, being sent out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Sometimes it can seem like that in the church. The church has been known that sometimes in a church you can be like a sheep in the midst of wolves too. So, yeah. Anyway, we won't go any further than that. But what I do want to show you is I did find yesterday. Let me see if I can bring this up, and you have it on your lessons on it, is I found an article that is what happened to the 12 apostles. So since we have the 12 apostles named, so I have this up here for you. So just so you kind of know, it kind of lists them all out here. So you got Peter and also Paul, both of them were martyred in Rome during the persecution under Emperor Nero. Paul was beheaded, and many of us know the tradition behind Peter. I mean, by the way, these are traditions. We don't know these for sure. But Peter was crucified upside down at his request, since he didn't feel he was worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. So Andrew went to the land of the man-eaters, so what is now the Soviet Union. And Christians there claim him as the first to bring the gospel there. It also says about how he was also in modern-day Turkey. Thomas, it talks a little bit about him, but tradition has him preaching as far east as India. There is still a group of Christians that is in India that claim him as their founder. In fact, when Mary was an interim associate pastor up at Christ the King up in Peachtree Corners, there was a pastor there who was a part of it, that is a part of this Marthoma, I'm not sure how it exactly is pronounced, Christians, who was a part of that. So he is a part of that church in which they claim Thomas as their founder. But you can see there, their claim is that he died being pierced by 4 soldiers. Philip's in North Africa. He converted tradition has it they converted the wife of a Roman proconsul. In retaliation, he was cruelly put to death. Matthew was down in Persian Ethiopia. Tradition has it that he was stabbed to death down there. Bartholomew has him traveling all over as well, but he also died. James, the other James, there's several James, but we even have a little bit from the Jewish historian Josephus said that he was stoned and clubbed to death. Simon the Zealot was in Persia. Says he was killed after refusing to sacrifice to the sun god. Matthias is the one. In fact, that's spelled wrong. Matthias was chosen to replace Judas. He was traveled with Andrew to Syria, and he was put to death by burning. John. Tradition has John with Revelation. You all who have been around me long enough know that I question whether that's actually the case that John, the Apostle John, wrote Revelation. But it's interesting about the traditions, even though John is the only one who does not die a martyr's death. Tradition has him in exile on an island. Tradition has him being cast into burning oil, even though he didn't die from that. So it's not like John kind of escaped the things. But if you get the idea, the two things that I wanted to kind of share about all the disciples on here is when even that one line that we didn't get to about sheep in the midst of wolves. And you think about what we heard in Romans, all of the disciples suffered because of the gospel. All of them, with the exception of John, all of them, according to tradition, were killed for that. We're not in that situation in which we have that in our country, and we're not, but there are always going to be times in which that suffering for what we believe in is going to come. And we've been given, these examples before us, these disciples before us to say this. But the other thing besides, and sometimes there can be an emphasis on that, but I also want to think about what ends up happening with those disciples, at least according to tradition. And again, once again, keep in mind, these are all traditions. We don't know. We don't know for sure how they died or where exactly they went. We have these traditions, but I like this idea that the disciples are constantly pushed outward. Here you have, if you think about where Palestine and Israel is, and you have Thomas possibly going all the way to India, Andrew up to what now is the Soviet Union, Philip down to was it Philip? Or who did I say? Ethiopia. You had all these different ones are being pushed out all over the place so that the word can be known. It's a way that even though within our own lives we may find ourselves here, we're all called sometimes that as the disciples were called to push beyond their comfort level and their boundaries. You think of when you see how think about this too. When you think about how the disciples are pictured when they're with Jesus, I'm trying to be nice to them, but I can't be. They're rather stupid, okay? They never get it. When they're traveling around with Jesus, it's kind of like Peter, right? Peter there at the Last Supper. Oh, I'll never deny you. I'll die for you. And Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times tonight. What are you saying this for? But the whole idea is that this group that doesn't get it, that doesn't seem to understand, God uses them and forms them in such a way, empowers them, calls them in a way that they step away from their own comfort, their own land, preach the word, suffer, die, yes, but the word goes out. And, it's interesting I didn't know until looking this up yesterday. Not just, I knew about Thomas. I knew about this group of Christians that are there in India that still claim Thomas as their founder. But here you have groups of Christians that are up in the Soviet Union that go back and say, Andrew came to, we have, that's our tradition, that Andrew came to us. And it more says that whenever we think, how could God ever use me? I sure don't get it. There's a way of saying God can use every single one of us, even when we don't get it. Maybe especially when we don't get it, God can use us. The key is to be faithful. The key is to be faithful and keep pushing on. So, I'm past time. So, yeah, and just keep in mind, Bruce, that clock's fast. So I'm only 5 minutes past time, Bruce, not 10 minutes. So, but as far as prayers, I think you all know, Art Veal passed away early Tuesday morning. So it's been a heck of a week. So all I can tell you is that he really went quick. They had made arrangements for hospice to come in over the last last week they were making arrangements for hospice to come into the house. And then things went so downhill so quickly on Sunday. They brought him to the inpatient hospice care place over in McDonough. So they brought him here on Sunday, and he died early Tuesday morning. So, but
we have to pray. We have to pray for Bruce 1. He turns 85 this week.
Oh my gosh!
No, I don't.
When is it?
July.
Oh, July.
Let's not make him older than he is here,
Yeah,
Bruce.
it's going way too fast the way it is.
When's the birthday? When's the birthday, Bruce?
The 22nd.
Okay, I'll be back. I'll be back to wish you a happy birthday, Bruce.
I won't be here. I'll be in Minnesota.
There you go. There you go. So, well, good. Any other prayer requests? Besides Bruce surviving until his 85th birthday?
Yeah, we can pray for him his trip.
There we go. When do you leave, Bruce?
July 5th.
July 5th. Okay. Well, good. All right. Well, Ward, thank you for joining us. So
My pleasure.
We'll close off. Let me say a prayer, and then we'll all join together with the Lord's Prayer. But let's pray. God, I thank you for all of us who are gathered here together this morning, and just ask that you encourage us in our own journeys to be faithful, even in those times when we don't completely get it. Just encourage us just to keep our faith in you and keep following you, and ask you especially to be with Pat and Lindsay and Philip and Gabe and all of Art's family, all of us who are his friends and his church family as well. We thank you for what Art has meant for us, and we thank you that though we miss him terribly, we thank you that he is no longer suffering as he was. We also ask you to be with all the prayers that we have not spoken out loud here this morning, but we've held in the silence of our hearts. Ask you to be with us on that as well. So we lift all these up before you, dear God, as we pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right. Make a joyful noise, everyone, even if it has to be quiet. So, all right. We'll see you all later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.